Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well. My name is Kevin Scally, and I'm the Chief Relationship Officer at Charity Navigator. Thank you so much for tuning into Charity Navigator's live stream or watching a recorded version of this. And you're going to be excited to be a part of this, is that we have a really interesting and insightful topic to discuss today. Now, as all of you know, throughout the pandemic, the lives of everyone around the world has been impacted in a myriad of different ways. And nonprofits have had to innovate and adapt to continue programmatic operations, and in many cases, scaling up to serve more people than ever before, and have had to also find new ways to secure funding. So as part of this world that we all live in, we've been having continued conversations with organizations that are innovating and adapting. And today I have the pleasure of connecting with Kerri Murray, who's the president of ShelterBox USA, a highly rated nonprofit on Charity Navigator. Kerri, it's great to connect with you. How are you today?
Thank you, Kevin. It's great to see you. And thank you so much for having ShelterBox on today.
Of course. Well, I'm glad to hear that. So it would be great if you could provide an overview of who ShelterBox is as an organization, as well as how it's evolved over the past 20 years.
Sure. So ShelterBox is a global humanitarian aid organization. We are working every day to really help confront one of the biggest issues facing our planet. And that is this massive displacement of people. So more people are displaced in our world today than any time in recorded history. The most recent numbers are 104 million people in our world. And that's people who've been displaced by conflict situations, as well as natural disaster situations, earthquakes, fires, floods, and then massive civil unrest and major catastrophic crisis situations that are facing our world. That number is only increasing each and every year. So ShelterBox, as an organizing principle, is really trying to tackle this issue of displacement. We are very narrowly focused on the provision of emergency shelter and basic supplies to set up household in the aftermath of something terrible. And so we were started 20 years ago. We were founded, really our roots are in Rotary, and we continue to remain the official project partner of Rotary International in emergencies. But as a separate 501c3 nonprofit organization, we really work to mobilize awareness and the resources to help tackle this problem. And a lot of people who know ShelterBox probably know us, Kevin, by this green box. And so when we were founded 20 years ago, our founders said, what are the basic things that you need to sustain your life if you lose everything in an instant? And really the center of gravity for the work that we do is around shelter, the provision of emergency shelter and basic supplies. So what you're looking at here is a standard relief tent. This is a place that a family will call home when they've lost their home in a disaster. And it looks like a recreation tent. It is not. This is made for a family to really live in for a period of weeks to months following a disaster. And I think through this COVID-19 pandemic, I think every person on the planet can probably relate to how important our home is to our health and our well-being during a major pandemic. Well, it's really critical in a pandemic. It's crucial after a disaster. So that's one of the main things that we put inside the box. The other things that you think about in a disaster crisis situation, you often lose power. So solar lanterns, so you have basic light to get back to work again, for kids to get back to school, to do basic tasks. You've had contamination of the water source. So we at ShelterBox, we include a water purification unit, as well as containers to store purified water. Aid organizations are bringing in food. What are you going to prepare a hot meal in? Boil water. So stainless steel cooking sets. And then mosquito nets to protect against vector-borne disease, waterproof ground mats, blankets, tools. In disasters, you see people digging out with their bare hands. So basic tools to help with the repair process. One box will serve one family. And for years, this was really the primary aid item and the primary tool that we deployed around the world. And really, the goal of what we do is always to enable the self-recovery of these communities, of these families. And families will live in the shelter and the ShelterBox tent or the ShelterBox tarpaulins and the tools that we provide. They'll use those to repair their home as they start to recover. But shelter is a critical step in the recovery process. And whether it's a conflict, whether it's a disaster, whether it's a pandemic, one of the most tangible differences we can make in the lives of families is to provide them with a shelter. It is the first step in the recovery process. So sometimes we deploy shelter boxes, those green boxes, and then oftentimes we provide a variety of different types of shelter items, different types of tents, as well as what you see here, which is called a shelter kit, which are the basic tarpaulins and tools and fixins to repair a shelter that's been damaged or actually create a single room shelter for a family. Now, we do this work with the help of volunteers. So we have a global base of volunteers, many more volunteers than we have paid staff. And we have a ShelterBox response team training program. This has been around since we started 2 decades ago, where we train civilian volunteers from all walks of life. And they deploy to the front lines of crisis situations, conducting assessments. In disaster situations, we coordinate within the UN shelter cluster. We coordinate with the UNHCR in conflict situations. They work through the logistical constraints of getting the aid in, working with beneficiaries and local NGOs on the ground to train on how to utilize the shelter, as well as do monitoring and evaluation so we can really demonstrate high levels of accountability and transparency around our work. But we're very much, Kevin, a volunteer-led organization. Over the past 2 decades, we have responded to some of the world's biggest crisis situations, bringing in shelter boxes as well as shelter situations in situations like Haiti. So you might remember 10 years ago, there was a massive earthquake that devastated Haiti. 1.5 million people lost their homes in an instant, and ShelterBox was one of the largest providers of shelter aid to the country after that disaster. Syria, so you may wonder what's the longest piece of our work, and it's been in response to the Syrian refugee crisis. We've been responding continually since 2012. Different types of aid items than what I've shared with you already. In this crisis, you have both Syrian refugees that have fled the country, as well as millions of internally displaced people that often live in these buildings, Kevin. So it's plastic sheeting for the bombed out buildings. It's everything from tarpaulins that they can easily move with, because people are often internally displaced several times because of the bombing within the country. This is one of the worst catastrophic humanitarian crisis situations in our generation. It often doesn't make the headlines in terms of humanitarian needs that exist, but they continue even today. And so, we're doing everything from children's clothing to cook sets, lights, and really basic things to help people that are enduring this terrible, terrible situation.
Great. Well, I appreciate the extremely thorough overview of ShelterBox, and I can hear and feel the passion in what you do, and appreciate you bringing the visual aids to this. Is fantastic, and really it pulls out a lot of heartstrings. And I think one of the things that you hit on as part of the overview is just how the pandemic has really brought to light the basic human needs, and how we can take those for granted on a day-to-day basis. Connected with a number of different organizations that speak to food insecurity and certainly shelter and a whole host of items. And there's more need than there ever has before. And one of the things that, because I've known about ShelterBox for a number of years, and certainly with Charity Navigator featuring you in a variety of different hot topics along the way for disaster relief and recovery. But, ShelterBox really does things differently with kind of the delivery model. See that complements other program servicing offers, and do you have partnerships that you've developed with other organizations to be able to provide kind of comprehensive care to those that are in need?
Yes. So at ShelterBox, we never go it alone. We are always in partnerships with other organizations. So we have a global partnership with Rotary International. They help us so much on the ground. Uh, in disasters, Kevin, there's this urgency to act, and there's always, never good information to act on. And so being able to have local partners on the ground that can really help provide that narrative around the beneficiaries and who's been impacted, where they've been impacted, what are the needs. So we work closely with our partner Rotary. We also have an international MOU with Habitat for Humanity. We work often with them. We work with the Red Cross, many local organizations on the ground in Syria. We have several local partners that help distribute our aid for us. So it really varies from place to place and circumstance to circumstance, but we are always working locally and with other actors on the ground.
Great. No, I'm glad to hear that. And I think you've hit on a couple of things. So certainly the partnerships and the unique approach that you've all taken. Mm-hmm. Now, I imagine that even with the help of volunteers, the work that you're all doing isn't possible without the support of funding.
Yeah.
So could you share kind of the approximate breakdown of where ShelterBox's funding come from and just how important donations from individuals are to your organization?
Sure. So for the past 2 decades, ShelterBox has been privately funded. And as a privately funded charity, the majority of our contributions actually come from individual donors. And it's across the compendium. I mean, it's small dollar donations to very large donations for specific designated project work. But most of our funding comes from individual supporters, as well as private foundations, charitable foundations, and some funding, a small piece of funding comes from corporations, but it's mostly individuals and then foundations.
Great, thank you for sharing. Well, connected to that, and like I mentioned earlier, is that ShelterBox USA has been a highly rated organization on Charity Navigator, starting in 2010 was your first rating. It's been highly rated over the past decade, and you've earned a 4-star rating, which is the highest possible rating consecutively for the past 4 years. Now to you, Kerri, what does your 4-star rating mean to ShelterBox, and what does it or should it mean to supporters or potential supporters?
Mm-hmm. Well, at ShelterBox, we have a long-standing commitment to accountability and transparency, and we work to map, track, and measure everything that we do. And so Charity Navigator is really critical for us because Charity Navigator, as you know, is rating the financial health of an organization, the accountability of an organization, the transparency of an organization, but it really works to show donors how efficiently that charity is using that support. And as a privately funded charity that relies on these charitable contributions to be able to scale and do this work every day, that commitment is critical for us. Now, what Charity Navigator has done in evaluating thousands of nonprofits, and you're the largest third-party charity evaluator out there, but what it really enables for our organization is for supporters, potential supporters that care about a certain issue. Say it's the conflict in Syria, it could be the cyclone in Vanuatu that happened earlier this year. It enables them to find organizations like ours that don't spend money on advertising in a significant way. And so for an organization like ours that is out there doing the work day in and day out, you really enable people to find us very efficiently and effectively, and almost serving as a referral mechanism so people can learn about us and they can take interest and they can participate. But that's been really, really critical. And I think having that 4-star rating for us and renewing that rating is critical for us, and that we are, demonstrating that commitment to accountability and transparency and really enabling people to find us. So it's been a huge, huge boost to our work. So we are really grateful, Kevin, to all the work that all of you do, because it is important for us. And it's important for us to be able to scale and serve more people each year.
Of course, and we're happy to be able to offer that service to nonprofits as well as donors themselves. And we find that time and time again is that donors rely on Charity Navigator during times of disaster and crisis and unrest, in that they want to make the world a better place, and they want to make sure that they're supporting good trusted nonprofits, and they're able to find organizations like yourself, whether it's our hot topics or just generally doing searching on our site. So happy to have you share that success story. One thing that I do want to remind those that have tuned in at home is that this is an interactive conversation. So if you have questions for me or Kerri, feel free to sound off in the chat, and we'll be able to address those. And Kerri, I know that you have a slide up about COVID-19, so just shifting gears a bit, since March, we've been surveying our rated nonprofits to get a sense of how much the pandemic has impacted them. As per our most recent survey, 72% of organizations reported being negatively impacted, while at the same time, 56% are seeing an increased demand in programs. So it's this interesting confluence of being asked to do more with less. How has the pandemic impacted ShelterBox USA financially?
Well, I would say it has definitely been a challenge. There's been many challenges that the pandemic has really confronted our organization with. The financial piece is just one, but it's an important one. For us at ShelterBox, the work of our organization has never been as important as it is right now. And COVID has just compounded. It's like adding a crisis and a disaster on top of a disaster. And it's made our work much more complex in so many ways. One way is obviously just the logistical constraints and bottlenecks, right? So supply chain bottlenecks, shortages, reduced airline flights. But, you know, in addition, we've got this pressure to do more. And I'd love to share with you why it's so important, but pressure to do more, respond more. However, at the same time, a massive pressure on so many of the constituents that support organizations like ours that right now are privately funded. So we know that people are digging deep, and a lot of charities have gotten hit really, really hard. And globally, our organization has as well. And I think during this time, we've seen a lot of private foundations digging really deep and getting out there and supporting organizations like ours, knowing that the work is so critically essential, particularly in vulnerable areas. And so I think our foundations have really stepped up and helped a lot. But I know our private charitable support has also been impacted. It's definitely constricted, but you know, it's only going to become more important. So I think the humanitarian demand is likely to continue to increase, but the funding streams for these organizations is likely to become more constrained.
Sure. Well, let's get into it. So I've spoken with several organizations who've shared just, you know, a lot of things that you're sharing now is that they've had to make significant changes to their program due to social distancing and interruptions with infrastructure. How has ShelterBox USA adapted over the past 6 months to still deliver on its programs?
Well, as a global humanitarian aid organization, we are, as I mentioned, Kevin, trying to confront this massive displacement that's facing our world. Now, as you can imagine, COVID-19 has only added a further challenge when you have people living in very overcrowded conditions, lack of water, lack of hygiene, lack of adequate sanitation, things that can likely contribute to the spread of COVID-19. And while this is a massive global pandemic that's impacting all of us, there are definitely vulnerable groups that will be disproportionately affected, particularly people who've been displaced by disaster and conflict situation. So when you look at the work of ShelterBox, so a big chunk of it, about half of it's in response to natural disaster, another half is in response to conflict situation where people are forced to flee with nothing but the clothes on their back. And particularly for refugees who are living in displacement camps, and we see this often, is that when you're getting processed into a displacement camp, a refugee camp, you're often held in what's called a collective center. And it could be a period of weeks or months that you're held in this transition shelter area that's very crowded, no opportunity for social or physical distancing for these families. And the hygiene is really, really little to none. And so our organization has had to adapt in many ways. One, in these refugee camp settings, it's a real push to get people moved more quickly into individual shelters where they can social distance and they can isolate their families. But we've had to adapt the aid package as well. So we're now including things routinely in our aid package at ShelterBox like soap, hand washing basins, having a health officer present at distributions that can actually teach families about the importance of hygiene, about the importance of maintaining physical distance from other people. We've had to adapt the aid package to include PPE. So routinely making sure our partners at distributions are using sanitizers, masks, gloves, washing hands. We've also had to adapt, and in some areas, we've really had to ensure that we're doing no harm. And so we're reducing the number of families that we can serve per day. So instead of bringing and deploying aid items to hundreds of people per day, it's often now maybe just in the dozens. So it's slowed down our ability to distribute as rapidly as before. So we've definitely had to look at how we can do this safely. So as you can see, when we're training families on using the aid, it's making sure they have masks, it's physically distancing the beneficiaries, but really we want to make sure that we're doing no harm. So it's the PPE, the soap and hand washing basins. In some instances, it means that we can't deploy the response team to the country because there's border restrictions. There's obviously quarantine periods. So we've really relied on local partners, and partnership is such an important piece of what we do. But this is a recent picture of, we were working with the IFRC, and when working locally with them, it was doing online training. So this was a response in Tanzania. Massive flooding, didn't really make the headlines, but displaced a lot of families, and we were sending in our shelter kits and aid items and doing remote distributions with our distribution partners online. So we're really doing that even more so now, is really helping to do training remotely via things like this, via Zoom.
Sure. Yeah. And I've heard that and experienced that myself, in that, there are obviously a lot of live events and live trainings have come to a screeching halt. And as a part of that, they've been moved over to a virtual environment. And I know that many are reporting at this point that they're having kind of the highest attendance that they've ever received. So in some ways, it even becomes more equitable, where you're able to reach folks that maybe you wouldn't have been able to reach before. I think that, it's certainly, disheartening to hear some of the constraints that have been put on ShelterBox and some of the issues that you've had in delivering service. But I'm hoping that there's some sort of silver lining that you're finding in being able to, kind of further increase the quality of care that's being provided, and that you're able to reach in new and innovative ways.
Yes, and I think this has only reaffirmed our desire to reach these families, and it's only increased the need for the work of ShelterBox, albeit the funding is very difficult, and in raising awareness of the work, particularly during obviously a big election year, and trying to, this work doesn't make the headlines, but the work is, it's life-saving to these families. I would like to share with you one family that our organization has been working to support during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's a big, important piece of our work in the Lake Chad Basin of Africa. And this is Fan, and Fan is 30 years old, and she is from Nigeria. And like many Nigerians, she was forced to flee her home due to Boko Haram violence. And Fan has 8 children, and she had never left her village before having to flee in the night. And she had to leave her disabled husband behind, but she said it was to save the lives of her children. She made it over the border to a camp called Minawao Camp in Cameroon. And it is a camp that was originally established for 20,000 people. It has swelled to over 70,000 people, primarily women and children that have fled with nothing but the clothes on their back. And for this single mom now who's living in this camp, it was during the COVID-19 pandemic that she found herself in one of those transit centers that I mentioned. She was living in a collective center for nearly 3 months. And ShelterBox was able to provide her family, and you can see it behind her, with an individual ShelterBox tent where her family could social distance and have private space in their own home to begin their recovery. Her family is likely to spend years living in this camp. And COVID had really put additional pressure on this camp and on these families. But we remain absolutely committed. In this camp, ShelterBox is the only provider of tents to new arrivals. So for all those families that are living in the transit center, they will have a place to call home because of ShelterBox. And we've remained absolutely determined and committed during this pandemic to make sure that we're reaching these families, including fans. And it's everything from the individual shelter that you see here, where she can provide for her family and remains distant, to also water purification, to basic cooking equipment. So families aren't sharing. They have their individual cook sets where she can prepare a hot meal for her family. She's also received water purification, blankets, mosquito nets, but basic items and household supplies to start her recovery again. Now, since she was been able to get into the shelter, she's been able to start working again. And she goes into the bush every day. She collects wood, and she's beginning to sell wood to be able to buy food for her family. So as I mentioned, shelter's just a really critical step in this process, because she's been enabled to now start the recovery again. And that's what shelter does. And I would say our sector is one that is chronically underfunded. It's chronically overlooked, but shelter, in addition to health, in addition to hygiene, in addition to food, is one of the most important things that we can do to help families like fans who are displaced during the pandemic.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And certainly an incredible success story. It's actually linked to a question that came in through the chat. So this is from CJ Bapp, asking for if you're able to provide a general narrative of what it's like for children that are involved in disaster, and then you're layering on the pandemic as well. So how are children, specifically impacted as a result of the situation that we're all facing?
Well, I would say both women and children are disproportionately affected by disaster. And what you see in our world, Kevin, as I mentioned, 104 million people displaced in our world. 75% of those are women and children. And particularly for children, you see during this pandemic, across the world, a massive implication as it results to their ability to obtain an education. And particularly when they're displaced in a refugee setting, in a conflict setting, or a natural disaster displacement, it really impacts their ability to get back to school. So particularly for kids, one of the things that shelter does is it helps stabilize that family's environment. So it enables families to get back to work again. It enables really children to start school and education again when they're able to be in a stabilized environment like having a shelter will do. But it's really critically important that we prioritize the most vulnerable. And that tends to be children in these environments.
Sure. Another comment that came through, and this is more just as an FYI of somebody who's extremely thankful for the partnership that has been developed. Lewis is a Rotary leader, and just saying how extremely proud they are of the partnership with ShelterBox and how it's allowed them to continue to provide assistance to global refugees, such as those fleeing from Boko Haram and in the Lake Chad Basin, even during COVID-19. So a nice
yes. So
and the lives that you're touching.
Well, you'll notice on the tent, there is a Rotary wheel. And if you don't know Rotary, well over 100 years old, one of the oldest service organizations in our world, and Rotary is in the DNA of everything that we do every day at ShelterBox. Lots of Rotarians on the ground, Kevin, really help our organization in these disaster situations. They serve as volunteers, translators, hot meals. They help construct the shelters, and oftentimes providing information to us about the severity of that disaster. So they really do help, and they are a huge tie that binds our ability to do this work. And you mentioned partnerships, and I don't know there's a better partner that we could have in this work that we do globally than an organization like Rotary International.
Fantastic. Well, Kerri, I'm sure that we've raised a lot of awareness of the work that you're all doing, and some of those that are watching at home are probably wondering how they can get involved with ShelterBox. So what are some of the ways that they can do so?
Kevin, I really believe everyone has something to contribute. And especially now during this pandemic, while we have to be physically distant, there's still so many ways that people can lean in and really help people who are vulnerable in our world. And this is an issue that ShelterBox is confronting. That's one of the biggest issues plaguing our planet. So on our website, ShelterBoxUSA.org, there are lots of ways that people can serve as volunteers and ambassadors to really leaning in and making a charitable donation. Our work right now has never been more important, and we definitely have massive financial constraints to doing this work. So if you can lean in at any level with a financial contribution, you can learn on our website. All of our responses right now have a COVID-19 pandemic response component to them, and we have a designated fund that's set up on the donation page. But from serving as volunteers, learning about the response team program, if you want to work on the front lines, deploying in disaster situations, there are so many ways, but this is a global village that makes this work possible. And we've been built on the backs of volunteers over 2 decades. And it's really, really important that we continue to get people engaged and involved in the work of this organization. So ShelterBoxUSA.org, and also following us on Facebook. It's a great way to get regular deployment updates and briefs on our work, on where we're working. We are deployed so many places right now around the world. COVID-19 has obviously impacted our whole world, but we can't take a day off. And our work continues across the world every single day, responding to disasters and conflict situations.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for connecting with me and the viewers and providing us insight on how you've been adapting. For those tuning in, thank you for participating, and we look forward to future conversations. And please stay tuned for future installments in our innovation series. But thank you so much, Kerri. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thanks for having us.
Take care.